thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here today. I've been teaching almost exclusively American Indian history and American Indian policy issues for more than 30 years now. And I just arrived at the University of Illinois a little more than a year ago, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm a white guy from Evanston, so I'm back close to my family. My wife is Blackfeet from Montana, so we were near her family for about 2.5 decades. Today, I'm going to talk about, I was asked to talk about boarding schools in American Indian communities. And I want to talk about them in relation to the time period and the federal policies of that time period when the boarding schools were established. I do have some photographs and pictures in the background so that when I'm talking, you have something to look at while you're listening to me. The era that the boarding schools were established in is known as an era of cultural genocide, which is what the federal government was practicing toward American Indian peoples at the time. And I'm going to see if I can move my slideshow along here. There we go. And it's part of a long history of shifting federal policies that sometimes remained very similar to each other and sometimes changed a lot. I've used this slide in my federal Indian policy classes and in my tribal sovereignty classes, and my students see this slide so often that it kind of becomes imprinted in their brains. I had a student once who actually went to Sunset Bay in Oregon and came back and told me that she didn't recognize the place because there was no list of federal Indian policy periods in the sky above the ocean. So this is something that that I kind of drill into the students. And so the earliest of our policies began with treaties that Indian nations and indigenous nations signed with the United States. Early on, these were treaties of alliance and treaties of friendship, as indigenous nations were more powerful than the United States. You'll even notice that the first treaty was signed in 1778, and that was before the United States became a country, but it's still recognized by our federal government as a legal document. And in that treaty, we invited the Delaware tribe to become the 14th colony. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how powerful indigenous nations were in the early treaty-making years. By the 1830s, these treaties became what sometimes are called removal treaties, or sometimes are referred to as deportation treaties, where the United States was significantly shrinking the land base of indigenous nations, sometimes through purchase, sometimes through outright theft of the lands. And when purchases did occur, Indian nations received pennies on the dollar for the value of their lands. It's been calculated that when you put together all the treaties that were signed and how much money was paid for the land that American Indians sold, that tribes received about 10 cents per acre for that land, which on average was valued at about $1.25 an acre. So they received less than 10% of the value of their land across the boards, some even more egregious than that. When they received money for their treaties, when they received funds for their treaties, the money didn't all come in cash. A lot of it came in initiatives that the federal policy was pushing that were similar to the initiatives that they would push during the cultural genocide era. So the United States would pay for missionaries, for example, to provide schooling for children, and the missionaries would use those funds to support their churches. And this was all part of an effort to deny American Indians the rights to practice their own religions and to live their own lifestyles. So there are all kinds of things in the treaty making era that lay the groundwork for this second period of cultural genocide, where there's just an all-out assault on American Indian nations and American Indian peoples by the U.S. federal government. By 1871, the United States stopped making treaties with tribes, but they continued making agreements, land sale agreements that were similar to treaties and are treated the same way under federal law as treaties are. But by the late 1800s, then there was this idea that American Indians were by then living in small reservation communities relative to their original land base, and that the United States had a responsibility toward at least the physical survival of American Indians as people. And this is something that's known as the trust relationship, and it's a legal relationship that the United States, it's a legal responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility of the United States toward indigenous nations that we owe Indian tribes in exchange for having taken almost all of their land and resources from them in the 19th century. There were several other policy periods that followed the cultural genocide period, and I could talk about those during questions and answers if people are interested. But I really want to focus on this era of cultural genocide and talk about the policies during that time period, of which the boarding school policy was just one. There were really four different initiatives during this time period where the federal government was working very hard to put an end to separate American Indian cultural heritage, and to try to force Indians to become part of the American landscape or the American cultural system and social system. And so I'm going to talk about each of them separately and finish with talking about education. And the first is a continuing of a land-taking policy. So American Indians have lost almost all their lands during the treaty-making period. And most Indian tribes then were confined to reservations, which were much reduced portions of their original homelands. And these were places then where it was very difficult for people to make a living because they didn't have the resources that they had previously had, but their population was kind of squished into a much smaller land base. And often reservation lands were the least desirable lands that the tribal nations had owned. Those were the places where the reservations were often established. But in the 1880s, a law was passed, the General Allotment Act was passed, also known as the Dawes Act for the senator who sponsored it. And this law, well, it's what's known as an enabling act, which means it didn't automatically apply to all tribes at once, but it enabled Congress to pass laws specific to individual tribal nations. And what it then did was to confiscate the land from the tribes and break it up into individual plots and then provide 80 acres or 160 acres, depending on the tribal community, for individuals to become farmers. Now, most of this land is west of the Mississippi River in the Great Plains, where there's very little rainfall. And so when you think of farming in places like the Midwest, it's very different than farming on the plains. Really, the successful farming that could occur on the Great Plains would be along river and creek banks. And in most cases where the land was provided to individual heads of household, that land was not in those areas where there was water. So it wasn't going to be a successful policy in terms of encouraging American Indians to become farmers. But it was successful in getting land away from tribal communities. There were really two groups of people that worked together to get this law passed. And one was kind of progressive reformers who recognized that Indian communities were impoverished places, and they thought that farming would help Indians become self-sufficient. They were wrong, but that's what they thought. And the other group was a series of people who just wanted access to Indian lands on reservations. And so there was oftentimes leftover land on the reservations after the allotments occurred, and this land was sold to non-Indians. So about 100 million acres of land under this policy in reservation communities was sold to non-Indian people, and Indians know there's an advertisement for buying that land that's shown on the slide here. And that land then went out of the hands of tribal members. The other thing that happened was, because people couldn't make a living on their land, and the land was best suited, for example, for large cattle ranches, individual tribal members then would lease their land instead of the 160-acre plots weren't really big enough for people to run a cattle ranch on. And so they'd lease their land to non-Indian cattle ranchers for a small amount of income. The other thing that happened was that this land that became allotted was subject to what they call Indian inheritance laws, where when somebody passed away, their family members received not a certain acreage of land, but a percentage of the land holding. And so within a few generations, those lands that tribal members still held often have several hundred owners of one small plot of land. And so then in order for that land to be used, it really has to be leased to somebody else. The land was also taxable, which meant that a lot of Native people, once they owed taxes and didn't have enough money to pay them, simply lost their land. And so the result of this policy was a great loss of lands within reservation communities, especially in the Western United States. So the land taking policies was one feature of the cultural genocide era, and it really impoverished people further and took them away from their land base in ways that have impacts that last all the way into the 21st century. Another feature of the policies of cultural genocide was denial of religious practices. I have up here on the slide show the language of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And the first part of it deals directly with religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those are two separate clauses that are really important clauses and distinct from each other. And one of the things that I'm old enough to remember, I was actually an adult when the United States passed a law called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. And to me, that was a shock. I didn't know very much at the time about American Indian history. You know, I grew up with the idea that we were a country that was founded on religious freedom. Why would we need to pass a law respecting and recognizing the right for the original people of this continent to practice their religion? Well, the reason is because we had suppressed it for an awful long time. This suppression predated the United States as a country, but throughout history, the effort to force American Indians to become Westernized included trying to force them to become Christianized. And so different Christian religious organizations with the support first of colonial governments and then the United States federal government, outlawed the practice of indigenous religions and religious practices. So in 1882, the Office of Indian Affairs actually submitted a list of rules through the Department of the Interior that banned traditional religious practices in indigenous communities, provided penalties for people who were caught practicing their own religion, and these included well-known and little-known religious practices. Among Plains Indians, one of the major religious celebrations is the Sundance, for example, and the Sundance was specifically banned as part of a religious practice. One of the cultural features of indigenous communities is sharing of resources, and this was banned as well. So giving away when there are certain tribal communities where leaders, for example, are best respected when they can acquire a significant amount of wealth and then give it away and spread it throughout the community through a religious and social event. And these were banned by the federal government in the 19th century. Ironically, when American Indians were able to perform at venues like the 1893 World's Fair, they were permitted to hold some of their religious ceremonies for tourists, even when they were outlawed from doing that at home. But the whole purpose of this was to kind of force American Indians to take up one of the Christian religions, either Catholicism or one of the Protestant religions, and to abandon their own religious practices. People would actually be thrown in jail if they didn't do that. This was slightly reversed in the 1930s in something known as Circular 1665, which lifted some of the bans, but it wasn't really until 1978 that the United States recognized the rights of American Indian people to practice their own indigenous religions. A third area then of cultural genocide policies had to do with governance. And so tribal governments were extremely weakened once reservations were established. The Indian agent in most reservation communities, who was employed by the Office of Indian Affairs, which was part of the Department of, well, it was part of the War Department until 1849, and then the Department of the Interior after that until today. The Indian agent had just a significant amount of power and authority over what happened in tribal communities. And so even though tribal governments might continue to exist, they were virtually powerless. And so were individual Indians. If an American Indian wanted to leave the reservation for any reason in the late 1800s or the early 1900s, they had to get written permission from the Indian agent, from the Office of Indian Affairs. Even in reservation communities that had massive forest resources, like the Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin or the Klamath Reservation in Oregon, if somebody wanted to gather firewood, they had to get written permission from the Indian agent to gather firewood, even dead wood that was lying in the woods. And so the control of what of the resources in those communities, in indigenous communities and in reservation communities, was almost entirely under the authority of the federal government. Indian leaders were appointed as judges in reservation courts, but they had very little authority over what laws they could enforce. They usually were permitted to hear cases in relation to domestic disputes, marriage and divorce, alcohol use because alcohol was banned in Indian country, and that was about it. So any other criminal or civil jurisdictional activities were under the control of the federal government. Congress passed a law in 1885 called the Major Crimes Act, which gave authority over major crimes such as murder and armed robbery and rape to the federal government. And so it's through the FBI that even to this day, if those crimes are committed in an Indian reservation, it's the federal government that investigates those crimes and enforces any punishment for those crimes. In some cases, Indian tribal governments were actually outlawed. That's what the Curtis Act in 1898 did in Indian Territory, which is now a major portion of Oklahoma. It actually banned the tribal governments from meeting and from carrying out any business. That's kind of the extreme case of federal governmental control over tribal governments. In most cases, tribal governments were able to meet to determine who could or could not be a citizen of the tribe, and very little else. They had no control over the resources on the reservation. From the 1870s into the 1930s and really into the 1980s in some cases, exploitation of oil or gas or timber resources were the responsibility of the federal government and not of tribal governments. What all this led to, of course, was an underdevelopment of governing systems. And so there were several generations of tribal leadership where people had in control of those governments had absolutely no authority. And so when in the mid to late 20th century, when tribal governments were established with more authority and more powers, they were coming from a place where for several generations, tribal leaders had no training, no skills, no abilities to manage the resources or the people in their tribal communities. So all of these policies were really focusing on pushing American Indian people to become part of the larger United States social system and legal system, with an idea that Congress has had for a long time to, in the words of various congressmen and women, get out of the Indian business altogether and put an end to the trust responsibility that the federal government has and the rights that Indian nations retained when they signed their treaties. Sometimes when we think of treaty rights, we think of rights that were granted to American Indians. But really, when Indians signed their treaties, what they did was they gave up land, they gave up access to certain resources, but they also held on to or retained rights that they'd had for hundreds or thousands of years previous to signing those treaties. And so these are retained rights that tribes have. And Congress and the Office of Indian Affairs was working in various ways to try to put an end to those rights, at the same time as indigenous nations were working very hard to try to retain those rights. Now, one of the things that federal leaders recognized, that missionary leaders recognized, and that people recognized, Europeans recognized even before the United States became a country, was that the easiest way to change people's value systems was to do it through children. And it's much harder to get adults to change the way they think than it is to get children to change the way they think. And so they had these education policies then that were part of the cultural genocide policies that began with the very youngest people in indigenous communities. And this began with the establishment of an off-reservation boarding school system, although there are also boarding schools on Indian reservations. And Richard Henry Pratt, who had fought Indians on the Great Plains in the 1870s, decided in the late 1870s to establish a school for American Indian children. And the first real boarding school, off-reservation boarding school that was established at an old army barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it's the Carlisle Indian Industrial School that he established. And his idea was to assure the survival of American Indian individuals, but not American Indian culture. You can see in the masthead here of this newspaper that the children published at the school that he has this phrase down near the bottom where the students purportedly said this, but this was the policy of the school. We can't help it if we are Indians. Indeed, we can help it. There is no hope for us until we kill all the Indian in us. And Pratt is well known for a phrase, kill the Indian and save the man, meaning to destroy the cultural heritage that American Indian people had and really assimilate them into white society. And so that was the focus of these boarding schools that popped up all over the country, from the West Coast to the East Coast, where children were taken from their families as young as 4 or 5 years old and shipped off to these boarding schools. And the curriculum in the boarding school was reading and writing in English. Children were banned from speaking their own languages in these schools so that they would be forced to learn the English language. And they would be trained to do kind of skilled labor. Girls in the boarding schools were trained to be to do domestic work so that they could become servants in white households. Boys, so cooking and sewing, for example. Boys were trained in carpentry or shoemaking or wagon wheel making, things that if they returned home, the federal government hoped that they would kind of take up those skills and change the ways that they lived in their reservation communities. The disciplinary systems in the schools were very harsh. And they introduced physical abuse to Indian country in a way that had never been part of most tribal communities. The way that children's behavior was modified in traditional tribal communities was through things like scolding and teasing and joking. And so children really wanted to please their elders, and so they would act accordingly. And if they didn't, then they were ostracized in some ways. But what they did at boarding schools, of course, was to beat children if they misbehaved in some way, if they were caught speaking their language, if they were not learning English fast enough, they would often be beaten. And so this became something where children being raised outside of their families without having parental influences, this would be their learned behavior. This is something that became part of indigenous cultures the way it was part of American culture at large. I mean, I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember, but even when I was in high school, it was common for children to be beaten. Our gym teacher had a leather belt that he called Roy Lee, and if you misbehaved in gym, he took you back into the locker room and he whipped you with it. This was in the 1970s. And so this is something that was not unique to the boarding schools. This was something that was part of the American education system that was now transferred to the way American Indian children were treated. Many children became extremely homesick when they were sent away to these boarding schools. They would run away from the boarding schools and try to return home, for example. And some of them would hop trains. They'd get to Chicago and hop another train and keep going farther west. The boarding schools were supported, whether they were federal run boarding schools like the Carlisle boarding school, or whether they were religiously run boarding schools, they were supported by funding from Congress. And so for each child that you had in a bed in a boarding school, you got $108. So if you had 100 kids in beds, you had $10,800 to run your school. And so it was very important for the leaders of these schools then to keep the number of children in the schools high enough to maintain the budget. So when children ran away, there were people who worked for the boarding schools whose jobs was to track them down. Children fairly regularly died in the boarding schools, and then the Commissioner of Indian Affairs would write to reservation schools and say, we need 3 more children sent to Carlisle Indian School or to Hampton Indian School in Virginia. And then those children would be taken from their families and sent away to those boarding schools. It was a very traumatic experience for the families, obviously, to lose their children. In some communities, I've seen correspondence where people write and say, it's very sad here. There are no children in our community anymore. And American Indian kinship and cultural practices is families are recognized as being much larger in Indian country than they are in most of the United States. People who are cousins are referred to as siblings. So my wife has 2 brothers through her mother, but she's got a dozen brothers and sisters who we would call cousins. Non-Indian people would call cousins, but they're her brothers and sisters. It's the same with my children. And so these families were multi-generational as well. And what this meant was that when children were lost to the boarding schools, the families were broken up. Those children who grew up in boarding schools then also didn't grow up with the skills to raise their own children in their own families. And so this became something that had a really negative impact on family life in Indian country. When children died at boarding schools, sometimes their parents didn't find out for quite a while. The children were often buried at boarding schools, and there's a movement now across Indian country for those children bodies to be sent back home to be reburied in their home communities. In my wife's community at the Blackfeet Reservation just this last week, a Blackfeet boy from Carlisle who died in the 1880s, I believe, was just returned home for the first time to be buried in his family's cemetery plot. And so those impacts were very largely negative on indigenous communities. It's hard to even imagine the pain of families at having their children virtually kidnapped from them and sent away to school, and sometimes not seeing them for 12 or 15 or 20 years until they are able to make their way back home, which is an extremely disruptive practice that was part of our federal government's policy. There were also boarding schools that were established within Indian communities on reservations. This is a photograph from one on the Menominee Indian Reservation in Wisconsin, where children are learning to be carpenters. Even in on-reservation boarding schools, it was often very difficult for the children to get home and spend time with their families. I'm thinking of the boarding school on the Blackfeet Reservation where my wife's family is from and where her grandmother was forced to attend. And that reservation is 40 miles long. And in the wintertime, when the snows are waist deep and people didn't have automobiles, may not even have had horses to travel back and forth, they often, even in those cases, would not have an opportunity to see their children very often. And so it's just hard to overstate the negative impacts of boarding schools on Indian individuals and on Indian communities. There were two schools in Illinois that boarded Indian children too, where the schools needed federal funds, and so they got Indian children sent here. The biggest one was up in Des Plaines at a place called St. Mary's, which is now Maryville Academy, which over in the 1880s brought in some 50 American Indian boys from two Lakota reservations, two Sioux reservations in North and South Dakota, and a Chippewa reservation in North Dakota. And those children were brought to this boarding school, which was a school for orphans from Chicago, mostly, because the school was in financial difficulties. And one way to get the money was the per head payment from the United States Congress for boarding school children in those schools. So even in places where there weren't Indian communities, there were these American Indian boarding schools. There were several in Indiana, for example, right next door to us, in Ohio, kind of Wisconsin, throughout the Midwest, and to the east and the west and the south and the southwest. Their boarding schools were just very common places. There were hundreds of them over time. There's now an organization called the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition that operates out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and works with survivors of boarding schools. I'll see if I can actually get into it. Okay, hopefully you can see the boarding school screen here, Healing Coalition screen. They have three major things that they do. One is research and education, where they're trying to find all the boarding schools that existed, and then they're trying to find all the documentation relating to those boarding schools. And so they're working very hard to digitize a lot of that documentation so that historians, but primarily so that members of indigenous communities will have access to that information. They built,
Dave,
yeah.
we can't see the organization that you clicked on. We can't see
Oh,
that on the
okay.
screen.
Let's see if I can put that up then. Let's see what, maybe I stop this share and try another screen share. It's been a while. Now can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay. And the third thing they do is, well, the second thing they do is they provide advocacy, working with the Department of the Interior and with tribal governments to try to advocate on behalf of survivors of boarding schools. And then they have a whole process where they work with survivors to provide some kind of healing for them. I'll see if this shows up when I click on it now. Do you see a map there starting to take shape?
Yeah, it's there.
Okay. And so this map is what they put together, and it shows the locations of the boarding schools in the United States and in Canada. And I don't know, you can click on these Here's the Homewood boarding school, the one in Peoria County in Illinois. And they just have a little bit of information about each of these when you click on them. And there's the St. Mary's boarding school in Des Plaines, where those 50 children were sent. So you can see from this that there's just a lot of these boarding schools that were established throughout the United States. And there is not a family in Indian country that wasn't impacted by the boarding school policies. I'm going to stop this share and go back to my slideshow then. But if you're interested, you can look up NABS, it's called the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and see some of the work they're doing on their website. Our younger daughter actually works for them now. Her job is to connect with elders who are survivors of those American Indian boarding schools, which didn't close down till the 1950s or 60s, and even later, or to the family members, the children who are suffering from the historical trauma, as the phrase goes, of those people who were part of the boarding school healing policies. So just to wrap up, during this time period of cultural genocide, you see that statue there on the right. This is a famous image that was kind of developed in the 1890s, where American Indians were viewed as a disappearing race or a vanishing race. We now kind of refer to that belief as the myth of the vanishing race. And it was partly because policymakers were hoping to put an end to Indian culture through these genocidal policies that I've talked about today. And we're hoping to kind of integrate American Indians into American society by putting an end to tribal cultural practices. And so this really amounted to really brutal attacks, not only on cultural heritage, but on tribal land bases and on children and family structures there. The strange bedfellows that I refer to here are the people who were pushing for what they thought was the best for American Indians to survive into the future at a time when tribal economies had been virtually destroyed, and those who wanted access to what was left of American Indian resources. The goals of assimilation really failed. There was a lot of destruction that occurred in tribal communities, but tribal individuals and people and leaders in communities, from religious leaders to educational leaders to political leaders, were able to maintain portions of their tribal heritage. And I always like to remind students of what the great African-American philosopher and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois said at the beginning of the 20th century, when he said the problem line of the 20th century or the problem of the 20th century is going to be the color line, meaning the racism in the United States and racial disparities and the way that people of different races who are not white were treated by the majority white population in the country. And most white people in the 20th century could ignore the color line. It didn't make that much difference in our lives if we were able to not think about it. But for people of color, it certainly was the problem of the 20th century and continues to be the problem of the 21st century. So even when American Indian children were indoctrinated successfully and were asked to become part of American society, once it came to job opportunities, oftentimes those opportunities really weren't there. By the late 1920s, Congress did another study of Indian country. It was published in a report known as the Merriam Report, and it found that all these policies had essentially failed. And so that led to a new era then of federal Indian policy and policy making. So thank you for your attention. And we have a few minutes left now. And so I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dave. I wanted to point out to everyone that I put in the chat the link to the boardingschoolshealing.org in case anyone wants to take a look at that. It should be available to everyone. And I
Thank you.
actually had one question. So when they do find the bodies of these children who might have died at a boarding school, how do they go about figuring out which tribe they came from, what the name of the person was? Is that possible?
It is possible, and sometimes it's easy, and sometimes it's very difficult. So many of the boarding schools actually have graveyards at the boarding schools. And in those cases, sometimes there are gravestones. I had friends 25 years ago now who, from the Menominee Reservation, a couple of the tribal elders uh, who traveled to the different boarding schools and identified the graveyards of the Menominee children at those boarding schools. In other cases, it's much more difficult. They're finding human remains through ground penetrating radar. And in that case, it's virtually impossible to know which children are related to which tribal community. In some cases as well, the graves were dug up and moved at various times historically, and so in those cases, it's very difficult to identify the children. But in cases where there are graves with gravestones, or sometimes there are records that the boarding schools kept, which actually plot out the cemeteries and say who was buried in which plot in each cemetery. So even if there are no gravestones, sometimes those children have been identified. So for the last decade or so now, various tribal communities have been bringing their children home and having them reburied in family or community graveyards, who have been able to be identified in that way. Other questions or comments?
Feel free to put them in the chat if you don't want to speak, and I will read them out.
Thank you, Dave, for the presentation. It was very interesting. I didn't know a lot of the things that you talked about. One thing you said was in the 1800s, American Indians, they were not even, they couldn't get like wood for even on or off reservation, not even for like cooking or just to keep themselves warm. Like they had to get permission before that, even for
Yes.
fallen trees.
Yeah, it is shocking the extent to which the federal government tried to exert control over people in tribal communities. So my first two books were on the history of the Menominee Indian tribe of Wisconsin, which today has one of the most successfully operated logging and forest operations on their 230,000 acre reservation, because they do such a good job managing it. In fact, they draw people from all over the world to come and see how they manage their forests so that they can keep it healthy. And at this point, they've cut the forest over 3 separate times, and there's more trees in the forest than ever. So they were known from the time their reservation was established for having this marvelous forest. But as I was reading the documents in the federal archives and the correspondence that went to the Indian agents, just time after time, I'm seeing notes from individuals saying, I need to gather firewood for winter, or I need to build a fence and I need to get 6 poles for my fence. Can I have permission to collect 6 trees that are lying on the ground to build my fence, to fix my fence? It's just kind of astonishing it was astonishing to me how heavily controlled those activities were, even in a place where there was this amazing forest resource.
The follow-up was like, how would anybody like enforce such a thing though? Like,
Well, yeah, I mean, so of course, people would just if it took too long to get permission, or if they were
yeah,
kind of thinking, this is my right, this is my
survival
land,
moment.
they would just go and um, take those resources themselves without going through the process of asking for permission. And so you're right. Oftentimes it was very difficult to enforce those things, but the Office of Indian Affairs had a police force on the reservation where sometimes they sent policemen around to try to enforce those rules.
That's very, I can't even say the word. I can't think of a bad word. But thank you so much
Yeah.
for the information.
Yes, you're welcome. There's a comment in the chat.
Yes, this is from Jaden Lakesy. Sorry if I mispronounced that last name. And she says, thank you so much for this. As a teacher educator, I noticed many of the practices that you spoke about, which are still seen in schools today. For example, I have witnessed and intervened as teachers told students that they had to speak English in class, even while working quietly with their peers. I'm not sure if I have a question about this so much as wondering about the types of incredibly racist and prejudiced practices that endure sociologically.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Um, back when I was younger, we had passed the Bilingual Education Act, which allowed for education in public. This is a federal law, which allowed for education in public schools in multiple languages. So not just teaching the language, but teaching in the language. And during the Clinton and Bush administrations, that was reversed so that English only became the rule in public schools. And the only time you could teach in a language was if you were doing it in order that the students would be learning in English. To me, this is a very short-sighted method of education. But in 1990, Congress passed a law called the Native American Languages Act, which actually trumps the U.S. Education Act and permits instruction in native languages in public schools, which in some communities people are doing. I have a friend whose granddaughter is now studying to get a master's degree or a PhD, I guess, in anthropology at the University of Wisconsin. So probably more than a decade ago now, when she was in middle school, she was teaching some children on the playground how to say hello in Menominee, and how to say thank you in Menominee. And she was actually kicked out of school for teaching Menominee in the class or on the playground, because the teachers thought she was probably teaching the kids how to say mean things about the teachers or something. I don't know. So this is an issue that both in Indian country and for people of other language backgrounds is a real problematic issue still in our education system in the United States. So thank you for that comment.
I'm curious, how do the different tribes deal with the U.S. government now? Because I know there's been problems with, say, the pipelines going across reservation lands. What exactly do they have I know you had talked about what they gave away, but what they also kept as their rights. What does that look like today?
That I can't really cover it well in 2 minutes here that we have left. But tribes have retained treaty rights, and they can use those treaty rights then to which some are related to what happens in reservation communities, and some of those rights extend beyond reservation lands to what are called the aboriginal lands of the tribes or the historic lands of the tribes. And so they can exert those rights. For example, in some cases, tribes actually have the right to clean water to flow through the reservation. And that means that they have the right to oversee the quality of water outside of the reservation that flows into the reservation so that they have that clean water. In the 1970s, the United States began to empower tribes to have more authority over a lot of what happens in their communities. And so both by laws that Congress has passed and by their rights under treaties and under the trust relationship, tribal nations today have a variety of levers they can use to try to exert authority over issues that they deal with.
So there are still schools on reservations to this day. Do they have full autonomy to run the schools the way they want without government interference now, or is what's
There are
happening?
still boarding schools off reservations as well, but those schools are operated for the last 40 or 50 years. They've been operated differently than they originally were. And at this point, it's totally up to the family's choice whether they want to send those children to schools or not. The children are not taken from their families and sent to those schools. There are public schools on reservations. Most of the schools on reservations are public schools. There are some schools that are run by the Bureau of Indian Education. There are some religious schools and private schools on reservations. There are some language immersion schools that tribal communities have established on their reservations. Most of the kids on reservations go to public schools that are run by local school boards, and sometimes it's the case where tribal members now run those school boards. In some cases, it's not. It varies a lot from community to community.
All right, we're at 1 o'clock, so we're going to be wrapping this up. If does anyone like to have any one last question that we can throw at Dave here? If not, we will wrap this up. Dave, thank you so much for speaking with us. This was a wonderful presentation, and I think an important one for all of us to learn from our history, the history of Illinois and the history of these boarding schools. Thank you again, and thank you everyone who attended.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for your attention and your time today.